Newsies, the kids who showed the importance of children. Although the Newsies were labeled as insignificant kids, they had an undeniable impact on children's rights. In July 1899, two newspaper companies in New York, the Evening World and the Journal, set an unfair price, causing the Newsies to make less than their already low income. The Newsies went on strike against the two newspaper companies, holding major protests and inspiring others around the Northeast to change child labor injustices, which resulted in child labor regulations and laws. In the 19th century, newspapers were the only way people could get information about ongoing events, news updates, and events that occurred. The most crucial part of these newspaper companies' profits were the newsboys the companies hired. Even with the newsboys' importance, they still had a tough life, with almost all of them being homeless and many being orphans. They would work for these companies out of necessity to make money, since most other jobs wouldn't accept kids. Their job was to buy from the newspaper companies a stack of 100 newspapers for 50 cents and sell them at a cent apiece to make money. This system has its problems since they don't always sell all of their purchased papers, and to make profit, they would have to sell over 50 newspapers, and they have to sell them within one day since it would become outdated later. During the Spanish American War, all of the newspaper companies in Manhattan, New York, decided to seize this chance to make more profit and raise their prices to 60 cents per 100 newspapers. The newsboys were fine with it, since this war made more people want to stay informed and they were making a similar profit. After the war ended, the newsboys expected the prices to be lowered back to the original 50 cents per 100 papers. All of the newspaper companies lowered their prices as expected except for two: the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, and the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst. The Newsies were angered by these two companies' blatant disregard of the importance of 10 cents to them. To combat this, they decided to boycott those two companies and not buy or sell anything from them, even though the possibility of a lower income would make their lives much harder. The majority of the Newsies agreed on boycotting the two companies, and they encouraged the public not to purchase newspapers from anybody selling the World or the Journal. Even so, in the beginning, many Newsies weren't so loyal. They kept on selling these two newspapers since they were too afraid of losing profit. The newspaper companies also paid people other than the Newsies to sell their papers, which had earned the title scab papers. They did this in an attempt to still produce money, even with the Newsies strike going on. When the loyal Newsies found out about this, they beat up anybody still working for the companies and ripped up their papers. Many news companies supported the Newsies. They felt that their protests were damaging opposing news companies and bringing more people to them. Because of this, they reported on the strike every day, trying to bring as much attention to it as possible. After a few days, more newsboys from outside of Manhattan joined the protest. Eventually, there were so many newsboys that they had to rent out a town hall to hold a meeting. Around 5,000 newsboys came to the meeting, with only 2,000 being able to fit inside of the town hall, with no room to spare. The rest of the newsies that couldn't fit were sitting outside and yelling their approval of the speakers through the windows. They were led by 18-year-old Kid Blink and 21-year-old David Simons. Even though they were charismatic leaders, they were eventually kicked out of leading since a rumor started that they sold the scab papers, with a group of newsies chasing them around the street before leaving them alone. Other people tried stepping up to lead them, but they didn't have the same authority as the original leaders. Many citizens supported the newsies as they brought light to the unfairness of the situations by holding many rallies before moving to nonviolent methods. They even attempted starting a parade, which they canceled because of issues with obtaining a permit. They stayed strong, and they weren't going to give up until the news companies gave them what they asked for. The two companies had major losses, with their sales going from 360,000 newspaper sales every day to 125,000. These huge losses swayed them to change their decision, and they finally made a written agreement with the newsies to keep the price at 60 cents per 100 newspapers with return privileges. Return privileges means that the company will buy back any newspapers that the newsies don't sell at the end of the day for the price that they bought it at, guaranteeing that the newsies would make profit every time. Because of the newsies' protests, they improved the living standard of many newsboys to come. Thanks to them improving wages, a child working to support their family can produce more money and easier support them and themselves. The work of the newsboys showed what fair working conditions look like, and they set an example for future children never to be taken advantage of by businesses. Their protest was the first of many child labor protests to come. They also became an inspiration, as they're the first group of children to protest for their rights. And before them, nobody thought that kids could make a difference. They inspired many children and adults to protest for their own community's problems, and they changed the responsibility of children in protesting. The Newsies defied what people thought was possible, and they left an imprint in our minds that anybody can make a difference. Their effort was inspiring to many people for many years. Later on, many books were written, and a movie was also created about them to make sure that their story would continue on. In conclusion, the Newsies had a large impact on the responsibilities of working children. Even though they all had terrible lives, they managed to make a difference through unity and determination. Their successful protests with these conditions showed us that anyone can make a difference and taught us not to listen to doubt. Through their protests for human rights, they went against what people thought was possible, and they made a difference on not only their lives, but those to come. Without them, many protests wouldn't have happened since people would have succumbed to the amount of doubt on the possibility of success.